Ed Sullivan reached into his jacket and pulled out a small yellowed envelope. His famously stiff and formal on-camera bearing suddenly and completely dissolving into something considerably more vulnerable. A transformation so complete that several people present later said it took them several long seconds to fully register that they were watching the same reserved and famously awkward host they had known across decades of his broadcasts. It was October 9th, 1973, 11:47 p.m. NBC Studios in Burbank, and the man whose rigid, awkward stage presence had become one of the most affectionately parodied and most enduringly beloved fixtures of American television was about to reveal a private letter he had carried for 17 years. Coming up exactly what Elvis Presley wrote to Ed Sullivan in the weeks following his controversial and history-making 1956 television appearances, the specific private fear Elvis confessed in that letter that almost nobody in America ever knew he carried, and why Ed Sullivan had never shown this letter to another living soul until that exact evening. But before we dive in, I see messages all the time in the comments section that some of you didn't realize you weren't subscribed. So if you could do me a favor and double-check if you're a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's simple, it's free, and it's something anybody who watches this show frequently can do to help us keep everything going. Please do double-check if you've subscribed, and thank you so much because in a strange way, you're part of our history, and you're on this journey with us, and I appreciate you for that. Now let's get into what happened that night. Because what almost nobody watching that broadcast understood was that Elvis Presley, at the absolute peak of his meteoric rise to becoming the most famous entertainer in the world, had privately confessed a fear to Ed Sullivan that directly contradicted everything the American public believed about his supreme confidence. Ed Sullivan was born in Harlem, New York in 1901, and by the time Elvis Presley first appeared on his program in September of 1956, Sullivan had already established himself as one of the most influential figures in American entertainment television. His variety program serving as a genuine cultural gatekeeper capable of launching or validating careers across every category of American performance, from classical musicians and opera singers to comedians, dancers, and, eventually, the emerging generation of rock and roll performers who would come to define an entirely new era of American popular culture. Sullivan's own on-camera presence was famously stiff and formal, a specific and consistently awkward physical bearing that became, over the years, an affectionate running joke among American audiences and a frequent target of impressionists and comedians. But underneath this famously wooden public persona, Sullivan possessed a genuinely sophisticated understanding of American popular culture and a specific instinct for recognizing genuine talent that made his program's booking decisions enormously consequential for the careers of everyone who appeared on it. The specific origin of Sullivan's famously awkward on-camera presence deserves fuller understanding because it illuminates an important dimension of his character that his public persona rarely revealed. Sullivan had originally built his career as a newspaper columnist covering Broadway and entertainment news, a background that gave him genuine expertise in recognizing and evaluating talent, but that had never required or developed the specific performance skills that hosting a live television variety program demanded. His transition into television hosting occurred somewhat unexpectedly, driven by the specific commercial opportunity his considerable industry connections and his genuine eye for talent represented, rather than any personal ambition to become an on-camera performer himself. This background meant that Sullivan approached his own hosting duties with a specific and genuine humility about his limitations as a performer, understanding, with a clarity that few contemporary hosts possessed, that his actual value to the program rested substantially in his judgment about which acts to feature, rather than in any inherent on-camera charisma of his own. What almost nobody in the American public fully understood about the circumstances surrounding Elvis Presley's history-making appearances on Sullivan's program in the autumn of 1956 was the specific and genuine private anxiety that Elvis carried into those broadcasts, an anxiety that stood in complete and stark contrast to the supreme, swaggering confidence his stage performances projected to the millions of Americans watching from their living rooms. Elvis Presley had, by September of 1956, already generated enormous controversy through his television appearances on other programs. his physically expressive and sexually suggestive performance style drawing intense criticism from cultural conservatives who considered his stage presence morally corrosive to American youth. Criticism that had grown intense enough that Sullivan himself had initially declared, publicly, that he would never book Presley on his own program under any circumstances. Sullivan's initial public opposition reflected genuine and widely shared cultural anxieties of the period, concerns that extended well beyond simple aesthetic disagreement into genuine worry about the specific social consequences of Presley's enormous popularity among American teenagers. Religious leaders, newspaper columnists, and various cultural commentators had spent the preceding months publishing increasingly alarmed commentary about Presley's influence, characterizing his stage presence in terms that reflected genuine fear about what his popularity suggested about shifting American values regarding sexuality, authority, and traditional cultural boundaries. Sullivan, understanding his own program's specific position as a trusted family entertainment institution, watched by audiences spanning multiple generations, initially concluded that booking Presley would represent an unacceptable risk to the careful reputation his program had spent years building, a calculation that made his eventual reversal considerably more professionally significant than a simple booking decision. Sullivan's eventual reversal of this public position, driven substantially by the undeniable commercial reality of Presley's extraordinary popularity, meant that Elvis's eventual appearances on Sullivan's program carried an enormous and specific weight, both men understanding that this particular booking represented, in some sense, mainstream American entertainment's formal and highly visible acceptance of a cultural phenomenon that had, until that point, remained genuinely controversial and contested. A weight that neither man had fully anticipated when the actual negotiations for Presley's appearance were first being conducted. What almost nobody understood was the specific private terror this weight produced in Elvis Presley himself. A 21-year-old performer who had, by his own later private admission, spent the days before his first Sullivan appearance genuinely uncertain whether he was capable of meeting the specific and considerable cultural significance that this particular platform represented. The specific circumstances of Elvis's own background deserve additional attention here, because they illuminate exactly how disorienting his sudden and overwhelming fame actually was for a young man whose upbringing had given him almost no preparation for the scale of cultural significance he was suddenly being asked to carry. Elvis had grown up in genuine poverty in Tupelo, Mississippi, before his family relocated to Memphis, Tennessee, seeking better economic opportunities, a childhood shaped by considerable financial hardship and by a close and unusually intense relationship with his mother, Gladys, who remained, throughout Elvis's rapid rise to fame, one of the only people whose opinion he trusted completely regarding decisions that affected his rapidly changing life. This background meant that Elvis, at 21, was navigating unprecedented fame and unprecedented cultural significance, with remarkably little institutional or social preparation for what that significance actually required of him, a specific vulnerability that his confident, physically expressive stage persona concealed almost entirely from the millions of Americans who only ever encountered him through his television and recorded performances. Quick reminder before we continue, because this next part of the story matters enormously. If you're enjoying this so far, take just a second to hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment, because what happens on that stage in a few minutes reveals something about Elvis Presley that almost nobody in America ever understood at the height of his fame. Elvis Presley's 3 appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show, spanning September 1956 through January 1957, became among the most significant and most closely analyzed broadcasts in the entire history of American television, drawing audiences that included, by some estimates, over 80% of the American television viewing public for his final appearance, a figure that remains genuinely staggering by any subsequent broadcasting standard. The specific negotiations that ultimately produced these historic bookings deserve fuller documentation, because they illustrate exactly how significant a professional reversal Sullivan's eventual decision actually represented. Sullivan's production team, Recognizing the undeniable commercial reality of Presley's popularity despite Sullivan's own public reservations, eventually negotiated a considerable financial arrangement to secure Presley's appearance, a fee that at the time represented one of the largest sums ever paid for a single guest appearance in the history of television. A specific and public acknowledgement that commercial reality had ultimately overridden Sullivan's initial moral hesitation. This negotiation itself became a matter of considerable industry discussion. Competing networks and competing variety programs watching closely to see whether Sullivan's eventual capitulation would prove professionally wise or professionally embarrassing, a genuine uncertainty that added considerable additional pressure to broadcasts that were already carrying enormous cultural weight before either Sullivan or Presley ever stepped in front of the actual cameras. The controversy surrounding his physically expressive performance style, which prompted CBS to eventually film him only from the waist upward during his later appearances, generated exactly the kind of intense cultural attention that placed Elvis, a young performer still relatively early in his career, at the center of a genuinely contentious national conversation about morality, youth culture, and the specific direction American entertainment was heading. A controversy so significant that it continued generating substantial newspaper commentary and public debate for weeks following each individual broadcast. According to an account that Ed Sullivan eventually gave to exactly one trusted colleague decades later, Elvis wrote him a private letter in the weeks following his final Sullivan appearance in January of 1957, a letter that Sullivan received with genuine surprise, given that the two men had maintained only the ordinary professional courtesy typical of a host and a featured guest across their 3 broadcasts together. The letter, according to this account, was handwritten, several pages long, and contained a level of genuine emotional candor that surprised Sullivan considerably, given the brief and largely professional nature of their actual working relationship. Sullivan described the physical appearance of the letter itself in considerable detail to his trusted colleague, noting Elvis's distinctive handwriting, energetic and somewhat uneven, suggesting a letter written quickly and without extensive revision, the specific quality of unguarded spontaneity rather than carefully composed public statement. This physical quality of the letter, according to Sullivan, was itself part of what made it feel so genuinely significant to him. Evidence that Elvis had written it in a moment of authentic private reflection rather than as any kind of calculated public relations gesture designed for eventual publication or disclosure. In this letter, Elvis reportedly thanked Sullivan specifically for the professional risk Sullivan had taken by ultimately booking him despite his own earlier public statements against doing so, understanding, with a clarity that surprised Sullivan given Elvis's relatively young age, exactly how much genuine professional and reputational risk Sullivan had absorbed on his behalf, a maturity of perspective that Sullivan said he had not fully expected from a performer whose public image, at that time, suggested considerably less self-awareness than the letter actually demonstrated. But the letter's most significant content, according to Sullivan's account, was Elvis's genuine and unguarded confession of the specific terror he had experienced throughout the entire period of controversy surrounding his television appearances, a fear that the entire phenomenon of his sudden fame represented something he did not actually understand or feel equipped to navigate, and a specific and considerable anxiety that the very qualities that had made him suddenly famous, his physical performance style and his particular musical sensibility, might prove to be temporary novelties that America's cultural gatekeepers, people like Sullivan himself, could just as easily decide to reject as they had initially decided to embrace. Sullivan never showed this letter publicly during the following 17 years. Understanding, according to what he eventually confided to his one trusted colleague, that Elvis's confession represented a genuine and vulnerable admission that the young performer had likely never intended for anyone beyond Sullivan himself to see. A private moment of honest uncertainty that Elvis's carefully constructed public image of supreme confidence would have been considerably damaged by public exposure of. This decision reflected a specific and consistent ethical position Sullivan maintained throughout his entire career regarding the private correspondence and private confidences he received from the many performers who appeared on his program over the decades. According to people who worked closely with him, Sullivan received considerable private correspondence from performers across his career, thank you letters, personal confessions, and occasional requests for advice or guidance. And he maintained a consistent and rigorous personal policy of treating all such correspondence as genuinely private, regardless of how professionally advantageous disclosing. Certain letters might have been to his own public reputation as a discerning talent evaluator. This policy, considerably more disciplined than the ordinary professional courtesy other entertainment figures of his era, typically extended to private correspondence, reflected Sullivan's own genuine understanding of the specific vulnerability that came with being famous, an understanding he had developed through decades of close professional proximity to performers navigating exactly the kind of overwhelming and disorienting fame that Elvis was experiencing in the specific letter Sullivan had received. Sullivan kept the letter in a personal file separate from his professional correspondence. A small and specific acknowledgement of exactly how significant he privately considered this particular piece of communication from a performer who had, by the early 1970s, become one of the most successful and most culturally significant entertainers in American history. Johnny Carson had booked Ed Sullivan for that evening's broadcast to discuss his own considerable career and his reflections on the changing landscape of American television. An appearance built entirely around warm, nostalgic conversation about one of the most influential careers in the history of American broadcasting. Carson himself having grown up watching Sullivan's program and holding a genuine and specific personal admiration for what Sullivan had accomplished across his own considerably long tenure at the center of American entertainment television. Nobody on the production staff had any indication that the broadcast would turn toward anything resembling Sullivan's private 17-year-old correspondence with Elvis Presley. The broadcast began exactly as anticipated, Sullivan discussing his considerable career with the same formal, slightly stiff public bearing that had become one of his most recognizable and most affectionately regarded trademarks. Roughly 17 minutes into the broadcast, Carson, with genuine curiosity about one of the most historically significant moments in Sullivan's extensive broadcasting career, asked him to reflect on what booking Elvis Presley back in 1956 had actually meant to him personally. Do not miss what happens next, because it is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Ed Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, and several people present described a specific and unmistakable shift in his characteristically formal expression, something considerably more personal and considerably more reflective beginning to surface. He said that he had never publicly discussed a specific piece of correspondence he had received from Elvis in the weeks following their final broadcast together, and that something about the specific way Carson had asked the question focused not simply on the controversy but on what the experience had genuinely meant, had made him feel, for the first time in 17 years, that perhaps the moment had finally arrived to share it. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a small, yellowed envelope, holding it for a long moment without opening it, the studio growing quiet as the audience sensed, with the specific attentiveness that builds when a beloved and famously reserved public figure begins to shift into something more genuinely emotional. Several people present described this specific moment as genuinely disorienting given how completely it departed from every previous public appearance Sullivan had ever made. His careful and consistently formal on-camera bearing suddenly and visibly giving way to something the studio audience had simply never had occasion to witness from him before, regardless of how many decades of his broadcasts they had watched throughout their own lives. He explained, for the first time in any public setting, that this was the actual letter Elvis Presley had sent him in early 1957, a letter he had kept private for 17 years, out of respect for what he understood to be Elvis's genuinely vulnerable and unguarded state of mind at the time of writing it. Sullivan read a portion of the letter aloud, his own formal and famously wooden delivery softening considerably as he spoke Elvis's actual words, describing the young performer's genuine gratitude for Sullivan's professional risk, and the specific and unguarded confession of fear that Elvis had shared, a young man privately terrified that his sudden and overwhelming fame might prove as temporary and as easily reversed as it had been sudden. Several people present described the specific and remarkable quality of watching Sullivan's own famously stiff public delivery genuinely dissolve during this reading, his careful and deliberate pacing giving way, in certain moments, to a raw catch in his voice that revealed exactly how much this particular piece of correspondence had actually meant to him across the preceding 17 years. This transformation itself became, for several audience members interviewed afterward, nearly as memorable as the actual content of the letter. Evidence of genuine feeling from a man whose entire public persona had been built around exactly the opposite impression: careful formality and controlled professional reserve. Sullivan's voice, according to everyone present, carried a specific emotion that stood in complete contrast to his usual stiff public delivery, revealing for the first time in any broadcast appearance across his extensive career a genuine and considerable tenderness toward a young performer he had, by his own admission, initially misjudged and publicly criticized before ultimately recognizing his genuine and historically significant talent. Carson, before asking this final question, sat quietly for a moment, allowing the full weight of what Sullivan had just revealed to settle over the studio, understanding, with the specific instinct that had made him the most trusted interviewer in American television, that this particular moment required patience rather than the swift conversational pivots that typically characterized his hosting style. Johnny Carson, listening to this account with genuine and evident emotion, asked Sullivan whether he had ever told Elvis directly how much that letter had meant to him. Sullivan said that he had not, that the specific formality of their professional relationship and his own considerable discomfort with genuine emotional expression had prevented him from ever directly acknowledging to Elvis how significant that private confession had actually been to him, a regret he said he carried privately, given that Elvis's continuing career by 1973 had made any casual personal contact between them considerably less likely than it might have been in their earlier years. He said that he hoped in some way that Elvis might eventually see this particular broadcast, understanding, finally and publicly, exactly how much that 17-year-old letter had genuinely meant to the man who had received it. The studio audience, 300 people who had come expecting warm, nostalgic reflection on Sullivan's considerable broadcasting career, sat in a silence that several people present described as the most complete and most genuinely moved silence they experienced at a live television taping, watching one of American broadcasting's most famously formal and reserved public figures reveal, for the first time in 17 years, a piece of genuine private correspondence that illuminated the actual human vulnerability underneath one of the most confident and most culturally significant performers in American history. Several audience members later described a specific privilege in witnessing this revelation, understanding, even as it unfolded, that they were among a genuinely small number of people who had ever been trusted with the actual content of correspondence connected to one of the most historically significant moments in the entire history of American broadcasting. What followed was a considerably longer and more genuinely candid conversation than either the audience or the production staff had anticipated. Sullivan discussing, with an openness he had never displayed publicly before, the specific texture of what it had actually meant to serve as one of American entertainment's most significant cultural gatekeepers during a period of genuine and rapid social change, and the particular weight of responsibility he had felt and continued to feel about the specific young performers whose careers his booking decisions had helped shape. He spoke in particular about several other young performers across his career whose early appearances on his program had similarly launched or significantly advanced careers that went on to achieve enormous cultural significance, describing a specific and consistent sense of responsibility he had carried throughout his career, about exactly how much influence his booking decisions actually carried over young performers' entire subsequent trajectories. Carson listened throughout with genuine fascination, understanding that Sullivan was offering, for the first time in any public interview, a considerably more complete and considerably more reflective account of his own career than audiences had ever previously had access to. The broadcast ran significantly over its scheduled time, NBC making no attempt to cut away from what had become one of the most unexpectedly candid, unscripted moments in the program's history. NBC's switchboard, according to production staff who monitored it, received an overwhelming volume of calls in the days following the broadcast, viewers writing and calling specifically to describe how deeply moved they had been, learning about the genuine private vulnerability that Elvis Presley had confessed at the absolute peak of his meteoric rise to fame, a revelation that many viewers said gave them a considerably more complete and considerably more human understanding of a performer whose public image had always suggested boundless and unshakable confidence. Several of these callers specifically mentioned their own experiences of sudden success or unexpected achievement, describing a particular resonance in learning that even someone as apparently confident and commercially successful as Elvis Presley had privately worried, at the height of his fame, that his success might prove fleeting. One caller, a small business owner who had recently experienced unexpected commercial success after years of struggle, told a production staff member that hearing Elvis's confessed fear had given him permission to acknowledge his own private anxiety about whether his recent success was sustainable, rather than continuing to project the same unshakable confidence that his own public professional persona had always required. This response, echoed across the substantial volume of calls and letters NBC received in the following weeks, suggested that what had happened on that stage had touched something considerably larger than the specific story of one legendary performer's private correspondence. A broader recognition among American viewers that genuine confidence and genuine fear about the future are not, in fact, mutually exclusive experiences. In the year between that broadcast and his own death, according to people close to him, Sullivan spoke about the Elvis letter and its eventual revelation with a specific and evident satisfaction, describing it in one of his final interviews as one of the moments he was proudest of across his entire extensive broadcasting career, not because of any professional achievement it represented, but because he had finally honored publicly the genuine trust a young performer had once placed in him during one of the most vulnerable moments of that performer's career. Ed Sullivan died on October 13, 1974, 1 year after that broadcast, and his obituaries across American media specifically referenced the Elvis letter revelation as one of the most genuinely moving and most historically significant moments of his extensive broadcasting career, evidence, several obituaries noted, of the considerable private thoughtfulness that existed underneath Sullivan's famously stiff and formal public persona. Several broadcasting historians who examined Sullivan's career in the decades following his death specifically cited this broadcast as one of the clearest available demonstrations of the genuine emotional depth that existed beneath his famously awkward and reserved on-camera presence, evidence that the affectionate jokes about his stiff delivery had always somewhat obscured a considerably more thoughtful and considerably more emotionally attuned man than his public reputation typically suggested. There is one final detail about this story that deserves to be understood, something that connects the entire arc of Sullivan and Presley's brief but historically significant professional relationship back to what happened on that Tonight Show stage. In the years following Sullivan's own death, when broadcasting historians and biographers began examining the full scope of his extensive career for various retrospective projects, several specifically identified the Elvis letter and its eventual public revelation as one of the most genuinely significant pieces of evidence available about the actual human dimension underlying one of the most consequential and most extensively analyzed moments in the entire history of American television. One historian, in a documentary examining the cultural significance of Presley's Sullivan appearances, noted that the broadcast offered rare and genuine insight into exactly what that historic moment had actually cost the young performer privately, evidence that even the most seemingly confident and culturally transformative artistic breakthroughs often concealed genuine private terror that audiences, watching only the confident final performance, rarely had any opportunity to witness or understand. If this story moved you tonight, I want you to think about the private letters and private confessions that the most seemingly confident people in your own life might be carrying, moments of genuine vulnerability that their careful public composure has never fully revealed. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that even the most seemingly confident and successful people often privately carry genuine fear about whether their success will prove lasting. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories about the private correspondence and private confessions behind America's most iconic entertainment moments. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and telling me about a moment of genuine vulnerability you have never shared publicly.